Hello everyone, Alex here from WarrenOffKeys.com, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can use a mute command within Discord.js using MongoDB. In a previous video I showed you how to use a mute command using Redis. This is going to be a slightly different approach that fits more of the theme of what we're going for throughout this series, because we're using MongoDB and we've used MongoDB many times throughout the previous videos. So this video will pair really well with the next video, where we create an unmute and isMuted command, so be sure to check that out once it's uploaded. And real quick, before we start, if you do need help with anything, then feel free to ask in the Warren Off Keys Discord server, and I'm sure someone will be able to help you there. So with that said, let's get started. Here I'm within my project. You can find a link to this project within the GitHub repository, which we found in the video description. And I'm going to be using the Commando framework. And if you don't know how to use the Commando framework, then a link on a tutorial for the Commando framework we found in the video description as well. However, if you prefer to use other command systems, then feel free to use those. So I'm going to go inside of my commands folder, and I'm going to go inside of moderation, and I'm going to make a new file. This will be called mute.js. Within here, I'm going to import Commando, so const Commando. This will equal require discord.js-commando, and then we are going to export a class that extends commando.command. This is a concept I've covered in a lot of previous videos, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I'm going to say module.exports equals class. We'll call this mute command, and this class is going to extend using the extend keyword commando.command. So we now inherit all the functionality, and then we want to create a constructor function, which will be ran whenever a new instance of this class is created. This is going to have a client object as an argument, and then we have to call the constructor function for the actual command class using the super function. We can then pass in client, and the second argument is going to be an object. This will have some properties in there that's going to configure our command. The first one will be name, which is mute. We can have group, which will be moderation, because that's a folder we're inside of. Our member name will be the same thing, mute. And actually, because I'm going to be testing this in the Warren Off Keys Discord server and I already have a mute command there, I'm going to name these _mute, but you can keep yours as mute. The only reason why I'm doing this is because I'll have two bots with the same command and it might look confusing. It might be weird. We might get some weird results if I'm trying to run the command from two different bots. After that, we're going to specify user permissions, which is going to be an array of permissions that the user who's running the command must have in order to use this. For simplicity, I'm just going to use administrator. You can use whatever you want though. And then I'm going to add in a description where you can add in anything you want. Mine is just going to be mutes a user. Now, after all of this, we need to have a run function. So we're going to say run, and this has to be an asynchronous function because we're going to be using await. So run equals async, and we're going to have our standard function declaration here. Now within the parameters, we're going to have a message, and we're going to have args. Now the syntax for this command is going to be !mute, the target user's @ and then a reason. And the way I'm going to design this mute command is going to be slightly different than most of the tutorials. This is going to be something where you have to specify a predetermined reason, and there's going to be a specific duration based upon that reason. There will also be no lifetime mutes, however you can easily configure this to be set up that way. That brings me to another point, that it's important that you understand what you're doing when it comes to these concepts and you have a solid understanding of JavaScript fundamentals. So the reason why there's no lifetime mutes is because each mute is going to stack. So if there is a previous mute that someone has had, then you're going to be muted for twice as long. If you have two previous mutes, you'll be muted for 3 times as long. So the mute duration will be multiplied by how many previous mutes the user has. So with this said, we're going to create an object above our class. This is going to be called reasons, and it's going to hold a key value pair, where the key is the name of the reason, and the value is how many hours that user should be muted for breaking that rule. So we can say const reasons equals an object. We're going to say spamming. We're actually going to put these in all caps. This will be 5 hours. And advertising, let's say 24 hours. So you can add in whatever reasons you want. I'll just stick to these two for simplicity. And so we want to make sure that they have mentioned the user, or mentioned a user rather, and that the reason is going to be a valid reason. Now, one thing that's important to note is that with Commando, by default, if someone sends a message, all of the arguments, so not the command, but only the arguments, are going to be sent as one single string within the argument right here. So the way to change this, so argument is going to be an array with one element being the @ and then the second element being the reason, is we have to go into the options here for this object, and we have to say arg type is going to be multiple. So now whenever the command is ran, we're going to have arguments being an array. The index 0 element is going to be the @ and index 1 is going to be the reason. Now we can check the length of the arguments to see if this is something that was correctly ran. So if they did not provide enough arguments or they provided too many arguments, we'll tell them the correct syntax. We can do this really simply with args.length. So if args.length is not exactly equal to 2, we can then complain to the user, message.reply, correct syntax. We'll say exclamation point mute, target @ and then reason. And then we want to make sure that we return so that we don't actually continue on with the code execution. However, there's a problem here, which is that we're assuming the command prefix is going to be an exclamation point. Because we're using Commando, we have access to configuring different command prefixes per individual server, and the server owner can do that through a very simple command. So we want to actually retrieve the command prefix for the current guild that we're inside of. So I'm going to take this entire string, and I'm going to cut it, and then delete the single quotes and add in template literals with backticks. Paste this back in, and then we can replace the exclamation point with the actual command prefix for this exact guild. So to do this, we need access to the guild. So I'm going to destructure guild from the message object. So const guild equals message. And now the guild and the message also are going to be not exactly the typical message and the typical guild you would retrieve from Discord.js. Because we're using a Commando class here, message and guild are going to be things that Commando takes and extends the functionality and adds additional properties and methods so we have more features. For example, the guild property right here is going to contain a command prefix, so we can actually use that. We can remove this right here. We can add in guild.command prefix. And now at this point, it's going to say the correct syntax is going to be guild.command prefix. And so if this is ran in a server where a question mark is the command prefix, we would see that. If this is ran in a server where an underscore is the command prefix, we would see that. And so this is going to make it so the correct syntax will be correct for whatever server we're inside of. Now after this, we want to make sure that someone was actually mentioned. So I can say const target equals message.mentions. Now mentions is going to provide a list of different users or channels that were mentioned within the actual message. And so we can access the users by doing .users, and then we can access the first user by doing .first. This is a method, so we're going to add in the parentheses. And then we want to make sure that this is actually a valid object and not null. So I could say if not target, which means that no one was actually mentioned. We can then complain to the user again. Message.reply. Please specify someone to mute, and then we can return. So now we need to make sure that the user provided a valid reason, something that we support within our reasons object. So scrolling down, I could say const reason. This is going to equal arguments index 1, because remember, index 0 will be the mention, and then index 1 will be the actual reason. Now because all of our reasons are in uppercase within this constant right here, within this object, we want to make sure that the user's input is also in uppercase. So we can do .to uppercase, because we don't want to just assume that the user is going to provide an uppercase string, so we're going to force their input to be uppercase here. Then we're going to see if this reason exists within the object. We could say if not reasons, index of reason, which will return a null or false value if this doesn't exist. So if they enter anything that isn't spamming or advertising, then this if statement will return to true. And so this entire code will be ran here, and so we can complain to the user mentioning what the valid arguments are. So I'm going to create a string that is going to be sent to the user that will hold a list of all valid reasons. So I could say let valid reasons. This is going to be an empty string. And then I'm going to loop through all of the reasons. So for const key in reasons. And so this is going to loop through all the reasons and put each key inside of the key variable here. So in the first iteration, key will be spamming. The second iteration, key will be advertising, and then it will break from the loop. That's because we have our keys as spamming and advertising right here. So at this point, we can say valid reasons. We're going to concatenate an additional string. I'm going to use template literal here. We're going to say key, and then we're going to add in a comma and a space. So the first iteration, valid reasons will say spamming, comma, space. After the second iteration, it'll say spamming, comma, space, advertising, comma, space, and then it'll break. So after the second iteration, we are going to have a comma space at the end when we don't want that. So we want to remove the last two characters of the string. We do this very simply by saying valid reasons equals valid reasons dot substring. Index 0 is the start, and then we're going to end at index valid reasons dot length -2. So this will remove the last two elements or last two characters from the string. After that, we want to actually send this message. So I'm going to say message.reply with a template literal, it'll say unknown reason, please use one of the following. And then we're going to add in valid reasons. Then we're going to make sure that we return so we don't continue with code execution. And now at this point, we're going to go ahead and test everything. To make sure everything works, I'm going to add in a message.reply that says works. And we're going to go through and make sure that all of our checks work to make sure that the command has to be within the correct syntax. So now I'm going to go into my console and I'm going to run the bot with node index.js. And then I'm going to go into Discord. We're going to go inside of my tutorial channel and I can run !mute at tutorial. Then it's going to say what the correct syntax is. So if I just say !mute, it'll also say that. So I could say mute test, and then it's going to say, please specify someone to mute. So I can say mute at tutorial and then testing. And then it's going to say unknown reason, please provide one of the following, spamming, comma, advertising. And you notice how there's no comma at the end of advertising. So I can now mute at tutorial with advertising, and it's going to say it works. So that means that all of our checks are working to make sure that the syntax is always going to be what we expect so that we can provide the proper mute. So going back into VS Code, we can now actually save this to the database, but first we want to read from the database how many previous mutes they have. So I'm going to get rid of this message.reply. And because we're about to use the database, we need a Mongo schema, which is going to act as a template or blueprint for how our data collection should actually be constructed. So I'm going to go inside my schemas folder and I'm going to make a new file. This will be called mute-schema.js. Within here, I'm going to import mongoose. So constant mongoose equals require mongoose. And then I'm going to create a schema called mute schema. So constant mute schema equals mongoose.schema with a capital S. Within here, there's going to be an object. The first property is going to be the user ID, and this is going to be a required string. Most of the properties within this object are going to be required string, and so if you've been following the series, you know that there's a simple way that I do this. I'm first going to create a constant called required string, and then assign the value to all the properties to that constant. So I can say constant required string. This is going to be an object that will say type is string, and required is true. Then the user ID can be required string, and then we're also going to have a reason, which will also be a required string. We're then going to have a staff ID, which whoever muted them, this will be a required string. And we're going to have a staff tag, which will also be a required string. We're going to then have expires, which is going to be its own object. The type will be date, and required will be true. After that, we're going to have current, which will also be an object, type of Boolean, and required is true. So expires is obvious, it's whenever the mute actually expires. But current is going to be if this mute is currently active and if the user is currently muted. Alternatively, we could check to see if expires is going to be a date from the past or the future, and we can use that to basically have its own current value. But I think that this is simpler to understand and simpler to use, so I'm just going to continue using this here. There's no real downside in reality. Now, after all of this, we have our first object here, our first argument rather, which is going to be all the properties. We can actually tag on a second object, which is going to be some options. And we could say timestamps will be true. And so this is going to add in created at and updated at timestamps automatically, so you don't have to. Now after that, we have to export this. We also have to run mongoose.model on this schema. So we're going to say module.exports equals mongoose.model. We'll pass the name of our schema. You could just say mutes, but I already use that table on the actual Warnoff keys bot. So I'm going to say mutes-testing. After that, I'm going to say mute schema. And then I'm going to save this file and close it. We should be good to go. And now I'm going to scroll all the way up and we're going to import that. So I could say const mute schema. This is going to equal require at schemas / mute-schema. The reason why I can use at schemas here to specify the actual schemas folder is because I'm using something called module aliases. I do have a video on that if you want to look it up. If you don't have module aliases and you want to use relative paths like normal, you can do that. You can simply access the schemas folder and then access mute schema using the .. notation to go back in the directory. However, because I have access to module aliases, I'm going to go ahead and use it here. So now we're going to want to fetch all of the previous mutes this user has had. We can also then loop through those mutes to see if any of them are current and then complain to the user. So the reason we're fetching all of these is one, like I just said, we're going to check if any of them are current, but two, we now get a amount of mutes that the user has had to then multiply the new duration by. So we'll say const previous mutes equals await, and then mute schema dot find. Within here, we're going to specify all the properties that's going to match within our documents. So the user ID will be target.id. So now what we want to do is we want to go through all of the elements that were returned within this array and see if any of them have current equals true. We can use a filter expression to return only values that have that statement and then check to see if that value exists. So I could say const currently muted equals previous mutes dot filter, and then within this callback here, we're going to specify the actual mute. So I can say mute right here, and then this function is going to return true or false depending on if this is something that we want to keep within this array. Now this isn't going to actually alter the previous mute array, but it will alter the return statement for what is sent into the currently muted object. So we want to say return mute.current is exactly equal to true. So at this point, only objects that will have mute.current as true will be returned into currently muted. And so we can say if currently muted.length. The reason for this is that this is going to be an array. So if there's an empty array returned, which means that he's currently not muted, then there's going to be nothing within here, so length will be 0. So length equals 0. However, if there's anything in here, there'll be an actual object, not a string, then length will equal 1, which is a true value. But if there's also multiple mutes, which there should never be, but for example, if there was, length will equal 2, which is also a true value. So this is basically going to say if anything is in the array. Now, in theory, unless there's a bug in the code, there should always only be 0 or 1 because you can't have 2 active mutes, because within this if statement, we're going to complain to the user that you've already muted the user. So within here, I could say message.reply. That user is already muted, and then we can return. We can also now use the previous mutes array to see how many previous mutes they already have. So I'm going to get a duration variable, and that duration is going to be equal to whatever the value is for the reason they provided. So I can say let duration equals reasons index of reason. And then I can multiply that by previous mutes plus 1. The reason why I'm adding plus 1 is that if this is the first time they're being muted, then previous mutes will be empty. And so therefore it is going to be something that will be multiplied by 0. Therefore the duration is 0. So we want to add 1 to it for representing the current new mute that we're about to provide. So at this point, if they've never been muted before, then their duration is going to be 5 because it'll basically just be 5 right here. And then if they've been muted once before this, then it'll be 10 because it'll be 5 times 2. 3 times before this will be 15 hours because it'll be 5 times 3, etc. So scrolling down, we now want to create an expires date. So const expires equals new date. And this is going to give us the current date for the current timestamp at the moment. And then we want to set the hours. So we could say expires.setHours. Within here, we'll say expires.getHours plus duration. Keep in mind that this is a function call, and this is going to set the hours equal to the correct duration that we want. And this is also going to provide the functionality to increase the days if it goes past a 24-hour period, or increase the weeks if it goes past a 7-day period, whatever it might be. And so now at this stage, we want to gain access to the author. So we have access to the actual staff. So scrolling up, we have our message object right here where we're destructuring guild. We also want to destructure author, but I'm wanting to rename this variable. And within destructuring, we can do that with a colon staff. So now this is essentially the same thing as saying const staff equals message.author. So now we have access to the staff variable. We can then use that to store the ID and the tag within our database. Because if you remember, within our schema, we do have the staff ID and the staff tag. That way we can actually use that within an isMuted command to see who muted the user, or you can check your own database. And we'll be creating that command in the next video. So I'm closing this. So now we're wanting to gain access to the muted role for this guild. So we're going to assume that the role is going to be called muted with a capital M. So I can say const role equals guild, which we already previously destructured, .roles.cache, .find, and .find is going to have a callback for each individual role. So now this is going to be similar to the filter expression where we're going to return true or false depending on if this is what we want. But the difference between find and filter is that filter is going to find anything and return it as an array. Find is only going to return one element that is not an array. So here we can return role.name is exactly equal to muted. And then we can make sure that we actually found a muted role. So if not role, we are then going to say message.reply could not find a muted role. And then we can return. So the server administrators who actually installed your bot will have to configure a muted role that is specifically typed like this. If you want this to be all lowercase or all uppercase, feel free to change that. This is just what I prefer, but you can add in whatever capitalization you want. So at this point, we do have access to the target who was mentioned right here on line 33, const target, but this is a user object and not a guild member object. The difference is a user object is going to have generic information about their Discord account, where a guild member object is going to have information similar to the user object, but also additional information based off of data they have within that guild, such as their nickname, how long they've been in that guild, other things like that. So we're wanting to access that so we can apply this role to that user. So I can say const target member equals, we're going to have parentheses here with await guild.members.fetch, and then outside of this will be returned a collection. We can say .get target.id. Now we can actually give this member the actual muted role. So target member .roles.add role. Let me actually rename this right here. So clicking on this, if I press F2 within VS Code, I can name this a muted role to be more clear. And so now we've given that user the muted role. Now, of course, it is up to the specific server owners what that muted role actually contains. They're going to have to configure that role to make it so they cannot type within text channels or join voice channels or however they want that role to be configured. That's not up to you, that's up to them. So once they have that, you're just going to apply that role to the user. Next, we're wanting to save a new document to the database. So I can say await new mute schema. There's going to be an object in here which will contain some data. And then after that, we're going to do .save. This is the syntax to actually insert something into a database. Going into our mute schema, I'm going to open this to the right panel over here. And then we can actually add in the information we need. So the first thing is user ID, which will be target.id. You could use target member here if you want. The ID will always be the same, so it doesn't matter. We then want the reason. I'm going to just not include the value. So ES6 knows that this is going to use reason as the key name and then the variable reason as the value. We also want a staff ID, which will be staff.id. If you remembered correctly, then scrolling up, here we actually destructured staff as our author. So we have access to whoever sent the message. We then have staff tag, which will be staff.user.tag. So if you ever want to check the database and see what the actual name is, you can go ahead and do that. We're then going to have expires, which I'm going to do the same thing as reason because expires is a variable that we already defined by setting the hours. Then we're going to have current, which is true. Because this is a new mute, this is always going to be something that is going to be true because we don't want to create an unmuted user right here. Now at this point, after this entire statement, we want to reply to the user saying that they've muted the target user. So message.reply with a template literal. We're going to say you muted, and then we're going to tag the target user. So target.id, you muted that user for, and then we want to enter in the reason. And then we're going to say they will be unmuted in duration hours. So I'm going to save this, and now we should be able to actually mute a user, and it should actually save to our database. So going into our testing server right here, and if I start the bot with node index.js, we can look at the tutorial and we see that it only has the owner role. It doesn't have the muted role. So I can do !mute at tutorial spamming. Okay, so I made a mistake here. Tag of undefined. So I believe that staff is already going to be a user, so I don't have to specify the user. I can just simply say staff.tag. So after I restart the bot, I can then say !mute at tutorial spamming. It's then going to say you muted tutorial for spamming. They'll be unmuted in 5 hours. If I click on here, they now have the muted role. So going into my Mongo database, we see mute testing right here. It added an S by default. That's something that Mongoose does. So clicking on that, we then see this object. We see the user ID. We see spamming. We see the staff ID. We see the tag and all the other information. So now we're wanting to make sure that this actually expires because we're going to check all of the current mutes every 10 minutes or every 2 minutes or whatever you want. And we're going to then unmute that user whenever that mute actually expires. We're also going to listen for whenever new people join, because with Discord, if you leave the server, it removes all of your roles. And so people can bypass mutes by leaving the server and rejoining. So whenever someone joins, we're wanting to check the database to see if they have a current mute, and then we want to apply that muted role. So going back into VS Code, I'm going to go inside of my features folder here, and I'm going to go inside of features, and I'm going to make a new folder called moderator or moderation. And within here, I'm going to make another file called mute.js. Now, if you don't know, within this project, all the features are automatically loaded. If you don't have a system like this, then feel free to just import and run this file. I'm going to start off by importing the mute schema. So const mute schema equals require at schemas / mute schema. I'm also going to export a function, so module.exports, and this function is going to have a client as the argument. So now within here, we're going to listen for whenever new members join a Discord. So we can say client.on. The event name is going to be guild member add, and then we're going to have a member object. And this function actually has to be an asynchronous function. And so within here, we're going to look to the database to see if the new member has been someone who is currently muted. So if they left the server and rejoined because they know how Discord permissions work, then we want to reapply that muted role. So I can destructure the guild and the ID from the member. So const guild and ID, this equals member. And then we want to say const current mute equals await mute schema dot find one. Here we want to say that the user ID will be ID and that current will be true. And I actually am just now realizing that I forgot an important part. We want to store the actual guild ID to the database. So let's go back into the mute schema. So going into schemas and then mute schema, we can go into the user ID. Directly below that, we can say guild ID as a required string. We can save this. The reason why we're doing this is because every single guild might have different mutes, and so we want to make sure that this is going to be a per server thing and not muted between multiple different guilds. This also gives us the ability to access the guild based off the ID, so we can actually apply or remove the muted role from the user. We can close this, and we also have to apply this in the commands. So we can say guild ID will be guild.id. So this is whenever we're actually inserting this within the actual mute command. So I can save this, and now that we have access to that within all the documents, we can go back and we are now going to pass in guild ID is going to be guild.id. So if this user joins a Discord and they're muted in that Discord, they have a current mute that has not expired yet, then we want to remute the user. So I can say if current mute, because this will return a null value if this doesn't exist. And so if they're not muted, current mute will be null, but if they are muted, current mute will not be null. And so we use an if statement to make sure that that exists. We then want to access the role. So const role equals guild.roles.cache. Let me minimize my console here. .find. This is going to give us a role. This is the exact same code that we wrote beforehand. We're going to return if role.name is exactly equal to muted. So now that we have access to this role, we want to see if it exists. So if role, we then want to apply that role to the member. So member.roles.add role. And now that this user has joined, they are now muted again. So within this entire base function that we're exporting, we're also wanting to create another function inside called const check mutes. And this will be a function right here that we're going to immediately invoke. Now this function is going to continuously recall itself using set timeout. So I'm going to say set timeout, check mutes, and then 1000 times 60. This will now run every minute. I want to run this actually every 10 minutes. So every 10 minutes, we're going to check the database to see if any current mutes have expired. And this has to now be an asynchronous function because we'll be using await within here. So now I can create a now date. So const now equals new date. This is going to be the current timestamp. And then I'm going to create a conditional object called conditional. This is going to say expires is going to be something called LT for less than. This is a Mongo expression. So if expires is less than now and current is true. If these two things are true, that means that this mute should expire, and we want to actually set current to false and unmute the user. So now at this point we can say const results equals await mute schema dot find. We can pass in the conditional. This is going to return all mutes across your entire bot or across all Discord servers that should be unmuted. Now we want to make sure this actually has valid results. So if results, and this is going to be an array, so if results and results.length. Now we know that this is a valid array that contains mutes that should be unmuted. At this point we can loop through them. So for const result of results. And then within here, we're going to want to access the guild. So const guild equals client.guilds.cache.get. And then we want to access the guild ID. There's going to be a number of different properties we're going to access from the result, so I'm just going to simply destructure them. So const guild, and then user ID. And so we have access to guild and user ID from the result object. So we're going to get guild right here. Or this actually should be guild ID, not guild. So here we have get guild ID. So we have access to the guild now because we have access to the guild ID. We now want access to the member. So const member equals await guild.members.fetch.get user ID. So at this point, we have access to the guild member object, so we can then remove that role from the user. We also want to gain access to the actual muted role for this exact guild, so const muted role equals guild.roles.cache.find. We're going to have a role right here. We're going to return if role.name is exactly equal to muted. But now at this stage, we can actually remove the muted role from the user. So we could say member.roles.remove. We can pass in the muted role. And then we want to update the database after we're done with this for loop. So instead of updating it within the for loop and updating each individual document, we're essentially just going to do a mass update after this for loop right here. So it's still within the if statement, so we know that we actually have things to update, and it's not an unnecessary call. But after the for loop, we want to say await mute schema.update mini. The first object is going to be the conditional, so we're going to pass in the conditional right here. So all objects that have expired time that is less than the current date and that the current is true, we then want to modify those documents. And then the thing we want to change is current will now be false. So this will simply just update all of the current for the exact mutes that are currently active. So I can now save this. And one thing I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to add in a console log in here. So console log checking mute data. That way we at least know that this function is running from within the console. Going back into right here on our console, we're going to run the bot. And we see checking mute data right here. The tutorial bot is now muted. Now one problem we have is that this user is currently muted, but this is before we added the guild ID to the document. So I'm wanting to delete this document. So I can click on the trash icon right here and click on delete. And then I'm wanting to remove the mute role. And I'm wanting to remute this user. So mute at tutorial, spamming. Now because we removed the document, this won't have 10 hours. It won't multiply with our previous documents because there are none. This will just mute for 5 hours. And this right here is just another feature from a different video. We can ignore that. So now that we've muted tutorial for spamming, we can go back and click on find. And we'll now see that there's a guild ID. We'll just do one-off keys ID right here. And that current is true. Now expires right here. If we take a look at this, we see that created at is on the 2nd hour right here and expires on the 7th. So I'm going to change this to the 2nd hour and that the minutes is 57. I'm going to change this to 58 and then I'm going to click on update. And so now this is going to be an expired mute that is going to be ran whenever this function right here is ran every 10 minutes. I'm also going to add in a console log right here so we can console log the results. Now that the timestamp is in the past, so it is something that should be unmuted because current is still true within our document. We can now run our bot and we are going to say checking mute data, and it shows that result right here is this information. If I go back into Discord, I click on this, the tutorial is no longer muted. And if I go back into Mongo and I click on find, beforehand, see that current is true, but if I click on find, current is now false. And this user is no longer muted. So this is how you're going to create a mute command using MongoDB. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about how to create an isMuted command and also a unmute command so that moderators can then unmute things. And I'll also talk about how to create a mod logs channel. For example, whenever someone gets muted, they will automatically be added into here. And whenever someone's mute expires, we can automatically add things into there as well. Thanks for watching this Discord.js tutorial. If you want to learn more about Discord.js, consider clicking on the playlist you see on your screen now. If you need help, feel free to leave a comment or ask in the Worn Off Keys Discord, which can be found in the video description.